I'm Rick Eckstein, the Acting Director of the Center for Peace and Justice Education here at Villanova, and on behalf of the staff of the center, I'd like to welcome you all to one of the many crescendos of this year's celebration of the life and legacy of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Before introducing tonight's speaker, I want to thank the several hundred Villanova students, staff, and faculty for participating in Monday's Day of Service. Let me also remind you all that tomorrow is our annual Freedom School, an event that has been going on here in one form or another since at least the 1970s, my historians tell me. The Freedom School will offer a variety of presentations on a variety of topics by a variety of faculty, students, and staff. These presentations will take place here in the Connolly Center between 10 a.m. and 2:30 p.m. If you need more information on the content of these sessions, please go to the Peace and Justice website at villanova.edu. Also tomorrow afternoon at 4:30 p.m. in the Driscoll Auditorium, there will be a workshop titled Prejudice plus Power equals Oppression. This will be organized and presented by a group of high school students from North Philadelphia and promises to be both interesting and exciting. And now for tonight's feature presentation. But before, I want to remind you of what's come to be known as Father Peter's dictum at talks like this. Those of you who are here for extra credit or here just because you were passing by and wanted to know what was going on, the evening is not over when our featured speaker is finished speaking. The evening is over when everybody has had a chance to ask their questions and there has been dialogue and conversation. So we're trying to avoid the mass stream of humanity, like 5 p.m. in New York City, out of the subways and into the abyss. So please stay for the entire talk and the questions and the answers. Now the Cliff Notes version of the introduction. Our speaker tonight is Professor Monica McDermott, whose talk will be on sports, shooting, and scholarships, myths of African American mobility. Professor McDermott came to Villanova before she was a professor. She was just Monica back then. She came in 1989 after growing up in Greenville, South Carolina. She graduated summa cum laude in 1993 with majors in sociology, history, and honors, and of course, a minor or concentration in peace and justice studies. She attended graduate school at Harvard University, received a PhD in sociology in 2001. Since then, she has been an assistant professor of sociology at Stanford University and affiliated with the school's programs in urban studies, African and African American studies, and comparative studies in race and ethnicity. In 2006, her first book, Working Class White, The Making and Unmaking of Race Relations, was published by the University of California Press to critical acclaim. Monica has also published articles in the Annals of the American Academy of Political and Social Science, Social Forces, Sociological Quarterly, and Sociological Forum. She's also been invited to speak at dozens of universities, including Villanova. More recently, she has turned her research attention to the class, ethnic, and racial frictions generated by the growing service economies in the Carolinas. So much for the Cliff Notes. Now the Entertainment Tonight version of the introduction. Monica McDermott arrived at Villanova 1 year before I did, and from the moment I stepped on campus in 1990, I was hearing all of this chatter about some hotshot sociology major that was destined for greatness. I'd heard those stories before in other towns along the dusty trail, only to find that the person was much more fizzle than fire. But one day I invited this kid from Greenville, South Carolina to sit down in my office and show me her stuff. Within 3 minutes, I discovered I'd made a terrible mistake. She was way smarter than I was and didn't mind showing it. It was the start of a 20-year personal and professional relationship that has certainly made me a better teacher, a better scholar, and maybe even a better person. In the old days, whenever Monica showed up in one of my classes, I knew I'd have to work extra hard to keep from embarrassing myself. She was like a shark. At the first sign of blood, she'd attack. I considered any class a success when Monica did not take one of my most brilliant insights and rip it to shreds in front of everyone else. And while she was at Villanova, Monica did not limit herself to strictly intellectual pursuits. She was deeply involved with the student groups in the Center for Peace and Justice Education, especially those which were combating racism both locally and globally. Appropriately, she also participated in planning the 1993 MLK Week, which perhaps set the seeds for today's appearance. Oh, and she also had a work-study job down in the Center for Peace and Justice Education, where she and Dr. Barbara Wall packed no less than 45,000 books to be shipped to tribal colleges and universities all over the United States who needed books for their classes. You'll notice her large biceps are a result from all that heavy lifting. There was never any doubt that Monica McDermott would become a brilliant scholar, but I'm enormously proud that throughout her graduate school and professional career at Harvard and now at Stanford, she's developed an unwavering affinity for undergraduate education. Unlike many professors at these prestigious schools, Monica believes in the intrinsic value of a liberal arts education and rejects the notion that good scholarship must come at the expense of good teaching. There are 3 examples that really illustrate this commitment to undergraduates, even in the face of institutional pressures to ignore undergraduates. First, when I visited her at Harvard during her second year of graduate school, she proudly showed me not a research paper, but her first undergraduate course evaluations. They were outstanding, and I bought her some ice cream. Second, her book, Working Class White, is accessible to undergraduate students, while also appealing to scholars. This was no accident. I've used the book in several classes, as have some of my colleagues, and seldom have heard a discouraging word from you Villanova students who are quick to lend discouraging words when you're discouraged. And finally, her talk tonight is not just some esoteric conversation and talk rehashing some obscure research project, but it's going to attempt to help all of us think more clearly about the possible unintended injustices that we face daily, including here at Villanova. Monica and I had been kicking around possible topics when, as an alumnus, she received Father Peter's email about the possible changes to Villanova's football program. Meanwhile, at that precise moment, through some astrological symbiosis, Monica was talking about sports in her race and ethnicity class. I was talking about race and ethnicity in my sports and society class. And we started talking about how sports can simultaneously reduce and exacerbate racism, and then she came up with the idea for this talk. Truth be told, and this is the truth, she was not our first choice as the keynote speaker. Full disclosure. We had invited Associate Supreme Court Justice Sonia Sotomayor, who had something to do. We invited Attorney General Eric Holder, who had to wash his hair or something. Thinking who would be next in line, the decision was simple. It would be Monica McDermott. So we've told her that when people ask her why she came to Villanova to give this talk, we said it's because the Associate Supreme Court Justice and the Attorney General were busy, and she was the next best thing. That should have been a much louder laugh, by the way. I've been working on that one all day. All right, so here's the question that we leave you with, and that Monica will address: are sports generally and college athletic scholarships specifically a useful way to address historical patterns of racism and discrimination? Let's find out. Please welcome back to Villanova, Monica McDermott.
Well, after that introduction, what more can be said? Thank you very much, actually. It's a great pleasure to return to my alma mater, which I have many, many fond memories, none of which actually include acting like a shark or beating up Rick for his incredibly idiotic ideas. But, I'm sure that all happened. So what I want to talk about this evening are 3 possible modes of mobility, upward mobility, for especially poor and working class young black men in America. And one of these paths of mobility is professional athletics. Another one is the military. And a third one is professional occupations, such as law, the professoriate, medicine. And I'm going to talk about why some of these paths towards mobility have become accepted as the ways in which we as a society think that black men can get ahead, the paths that are open to them, and those that we don't associate with young black men, and how these stereotypes that we have as a society can become internalized and can help in reproducing the class structure with poor black men staying in low-wage jobs. So I'd like to start with a quotation from Martin Luther King. And he says, we cannot be satisfied as long as the Negro's basic mobility is from a smaller ghetto to a larger one. In other words, movement upwards and out of one ghetto into another group that perpetuates anti-Black stereotypes and a position of Blacks not realizing their full potential is not true mobility. So as I mentioned, there are several alternate paths of upward social mobility. And I'll add corporate executive as another, along with some of the professions. So what do these have to do with race? There are externally generated expectations about what occupations or professions Blacks are good at. One of these externally generated expectations is that Blacks are good athletes, right? This is a stereotype that is predominant in American society. And I'll give you some evidence that supports this claim a little bit later. Another externally generated expectation is that Blacks aren't particularly intelligent. This is a stereotype that a majority of whites actually hold, according to survey data. And this, in turn, leads many young Black men in particular to think that it's not possible for them to become lawyers or physicians or professors. What is it possible for them to become? Athletes, or perhaps soldiers. And this, in turn, results in reduced opportunities for social mobility for Black Americans as a result of these expectations. How does this happen? Because those routes for upward mobility, especially athletics, are extraordinarily difficult to travel down. Are there people who climb out of the ghetto by becoming professional basketball players, professional football players? Absolutely. We know them very well. Their images are all over our television screens. But I'll show you in a moment what the actual odds are of becoming a professional athlete. They're extraordinarily small. Even if one has a full scholarship as a Division I athlete, the odds of becoming a professional are extraordinarily low. So focusing, especially if one is a young, poor, Black male high school student, should we say, focusing on becoming a professional athlete is a recipe for failure. If the focus is on athletic skills and that doesn't translate into a college scholarship, doesn't translate into a job as a professional athlete, then what is that young man left doing? He's typically left doing low-wage work at best. So don't take my word for the fact that whites tend to think of Blacks as being good athletes. If you ask Blacks themselves, what do you think white Americans think about your group? The number one stereotype is that Blacks are more likely to commit violent crimes than whites. Shortly after this is the stereotype that Blacks are better athletes than whites, with over 3/4 of the Black population knowing that this is what whites think about them. And shortly after that, the stereotype that Blacks are less intelligent than whites. Again, 3/4 of Blacks think that whites think they're less intelligent than they are. And the golf experiment. So this shows how this stereotype that is held by white Americans, even if, let's say, white Americans don't hold it, let's say no one thinks that Blacks are better athletes than whites. If Blacks think that whites think that they're better athletes than whites, then this has a real outcome, a real impact on the outcomes of performance. As an example, Jeff Stone and his colleagues tested among a group of college undergraduates, some Black, some white, what the impact was of telling them about what the golf outing's goal was. In one case, they said, this is a test of sports intelligence. Who did perform better? Who shot more, under par on the golf course? The whites did. When participants were told that the golf outing was a test of natural athletic ability, Blacks performed much better than whites. And this cuts both ways. Part of it is when blacks hear this is a test of natural athletic ability, they perform better. And when whites hear that it's a test of natural athletic ability, they perform worse. Same thing goes for sports intelligence. So the gap is on among both groups. So these stereotypes have real impacts on how people behave in the real world. I'll give you another example of some of these stereotypes, and bear with me, this is a somewhat complicated chart. So in Who's Who in America, which is a standard reference volume about who the elite people in American society are, it's short biographical data on each of them. And this is a different volume than Who's Who in the Northeast, Who's Who among American college teachers, Who's Who among nursing. You might have heard of some of these volumes. Those are money makers. They're not actual reference volumes. But Who's Who in America is an actual reference volume with a huge staff compiling who exactly is at the top of their professions in America. And this table shows the representation of different occupations in Who's Who and compares it to the representation of these occupations in Who's Who in Black America. So this is the same thing as Who's Who in America, except it's a black editor, it's a black staff, and it's geared for the black community. So there's a huge discrepancy in the prevalence of athletes in the mainstream volume of Who's Who in America. You can see there are 181 times the prevalence in the US population as a whole, and only 38 times their prevalence in blacks, Who's Who in Black America. Educators are much more highly represented in Who's Who in Black America, less well represented in Who's Who, and the same thing goes for physicians. So this shows that when the black community is looking amongst itself and says, who are the elite in our community, they're looking just as likely at physicians, at educators, as they are at athletes. When it's the white community looking at the black community, then it's athletes that are being very highly represented. So unfortunately, many of these stereotypes and expectations become internalized, such that young black men actually come to believe some of these understandings about what they're good at and what they're not good at. For example, black males have repeatedly been found to be more likely than white males to play high school athletics with the expectation of a scholarship and professional career. When most white male high school athletes play their sport, they're doing it, maybe to aid in a college application, but primarily because it's just a fun thing to do. When black men play a sport, they're looking at it as a mobility path, as a route out of difficult economic circumstances through a college scholarship initially, and then through potentially playing professionally. And this has been found in a study by Singer and May to be so extreme that most poor black men actually feel that sports is the only way out. It's the only route open to them. And Ruben May studied, he worked as a basketball coach in a poor black high school in Georgia. And he studied how this process actually worked among the young black men that he worked with. And he found in a number of cases, basically none of the people that he coached was good enough to get a Division I scholarship. It's a pretty rare thing to get a Division I scholarship to play athletics. As I'm sure many of you who are athletes in the room know, you're at the top of your game, right, to be here as a scholarship athlete at Villanova. And most people in high school, not, right? You remember all the competition you crushed when you were playing back in the day. So these are the people that Ruben May is coaching. They think that they're going to get scholarships and that they're going to play pro ball. And there's no way it's going to happen. They don't have the skills to do it. What happens as a consequence of this attitude? They tune out in school. They don't care about doing well academically. They want to do well enough to graduate, but that's it. Nothing beyond that. They don't think about applying to colleges with the goal of perhaps getting a non-athletic scholarship. And what ends up happening is no colleges are interested in them. They don't have any applications out. And they end up working at McDonald's and Jack in the Box when they finish high school, instead of strategically embarking on a path as many, many white male students do, to get the grades that are good enough, take the tests, SAT tests that you need to take, and go to college without an athletic scholarship. So I'm telling you that it's uncommon to play professional sports and to get a Division I scholarship. How uncommon is it? If you start with, this would be in thousands, so 475,000 fourth grade boys play basketball. That number drops off to 87,000 high school seniors. From this 87,000, and remember, and blacks are 2.5 times more likely to play high school basketball than our white males. From the 87,000 high school seniors in basketball, many of whom think they're going to get a Division I scholarship, only 2,910 actually do. The 4,310 who play Division III are not playing on scholarships. D3 doesn't give scholarships. But it could have played a factor in their admissions, but that would be the most. D1 and D2, you have 2,910 basketball players. That number dwindles down to 130 who play professionally overseas, primarily in Europe, and 30 a year who make the NBA. So this results in some pretty nasty transition probabilities. The odds of going from a high school career as a basketball player to the NBA are almost zero, very, very marginally above zero. The chances of playing professional basketball once you have an athletic scholarship at a D1 or D2 school are still, 0.055. Right? This is extremely low probability. And this is, among those who are at the top of their game. So what about the experience of those who do manage to get D1 scholarships? Among 70 bowl-bound football teams in 2010-11, there was an 80% graduation rate for white players, a 60% graduation rate for black players. And there was a pronounced gap in the graduation rate for the national champion Auburn Tigers, where it was well over 90% for the white players and hovering around 45% for the black players. Nonetheless, most studies find that on average, there are higher graduation rates for black athletes than for black non-athletes. This is among men. So there is a positive impact to playing athletics. But the experience of being an athlete, a black male athlete, especially at majority white colleges, can be a very alienating one. A study by Melendez at a majority white school in the Northeast, could be Villanova? No, it's not. Black players felt isolated, rejected, and mistrustful of their black and white classmates and their white teammates. So the experience of being a student at a majority white campus, of being an athlete, a black male athlete, a majority white campus, can be a very alienating one psychologically. And why is this the case? I'd like to turn your attention to some really astounding numbers. Focus on the Villanova bars here on this graph. So overall, in the US as a whole, this is among Division I schools, about 9% of black students, so 9% of black college students at Division I schools in America are on an athletic scholarship. This figure is about 5% for white male students. At Villanova, 37% of the black male students at this institution are here on an athletic scholarship. Right? So we wonder where some of the stereotypes come from and where the reinforcement of these stereotypes come from. When 37% of the black male student body are athletes, and of course, there's nothing wrong with being an athlete, of course, but when this comprises such a large proportion of the black male student body, I think that's worrisome, and we can talk about why and whether you think it's worrisome or not at the end of the talk. And I selected Georgetown here as a comparison just because they're the arch rivals, right? They're also, a small Catholic school. And part of the being small means that there's a higher proportion of white male students who are athletes as well as black male students. Auburn, Duke, and South Carolina are the 3 schools that won national championships in major men's sports, football, basketball, and baseball. And you can see here that they're much closer to the average, with the exception of Duke, again, which has a small enrollment. So, problems with athletic careers, right? They're highly unlikely to pay off. Okay. The military has played a very important role in the upward social mobility of black men who don't go to college. It's also played a key institutional role as an integrationist force since mid-century. The military is perceived by many black males to be an alternative to a discriminatory labor market. And this led to blacks being overrepresented as enlisted soldiers during the 1970s. This continued through much of the 1980s. Since the 1990s, however, black enlistments have declined. After 9/11, they took a nosedive. Part of the reason is that for this cohort, twice as many non-college educated black men are in prison as are in the military. The imprisonment rate of young black men has gone through the roof, and this is part of why military enlistments have dropped. It's possible to get into the military with a criminal record, but it's extremely difficult. You have to arrange for a waiver and so forth. And many people don't bother to try. So in the military, the difference between black and white marriage rates, which is huge in society at large, with whites getting married much more frequently than blacks, that difference disappears, right? Blacks are just as likely as whites to get married. There are a number of demographic factors like this that it equalizes if you just look at the military. There's virtually no racial residential segregation on military bases. And those with college aspirations are more likely to join the military out of high school than to find a job, especially if they are low SES or are in a community with strong military presence. So if you're a low SES person and you're a black male, you want to go to college, you think military, that's my way to get to college. So, I mean, it's not as common as wanting to play athletics, but it's common, especially if there's a strong military presence in the community in which the person is growing up. And most black Army veterans are actually quite happy with the experience. However, there's a downside. Blacks are 27% of enlistments, but only 12% of commissioned officers in the Army. And blacks are only about 5% of officers in other branches of the military, aside from the Army. Those blacks who do become officers in any of the branches of the armed forces are more likely to be in administrative support positions than they are in operations. And this means much fewer skills translating into the civilian labor market upon exit. So there are these drawbacks, but I think there are 2 really major drawbacks to using the military as a mobility path. The first one is that you die, right? The death rate of this occupation, this mobility path, a lot higher than for being a doctor or a lawyer or a professor, certainly a professor. Although, I mean, there are the periodic shootings and faculty meetings aside. It's just a lot riskier, right? You have a really high death rate. Also, it's psychologically quite grueling, especially if one is experiencing combat. And blacks actually have higher rates of PTSD related to combat experiences than do whites. So there's some huge costs to this mobility source. Shifting gears now to the managerial professional route. You see that only 25% of blacks, this is of blacks who are in the labor force, have managerial professional jobs. Hispanic rate is actually even lower, but this includes many first-generation immigrants. If you look at second-generation plus immigrants, then the rate of managerial professional occupation increases to surpass the rate for blacks. So there's a huge gap here, and there's a real need for blacks to enter into the professions. There's huge demand. looking at some of the specific occupations here. Look at the bar on the far left, total employed, as the point of comparison. So there are just over 10% of those who are employed in the labor force, this is 2009 data, are blacks. How many CEOs? About 3.5%. Civil engineers, 4%. Lawyers, 4.5%. Professors, 6%, and so on and so forth. Athletes are actually represented. This is athletes, coaches, and umpires. So this is a huge number of high school sports coaches are included in this figure. And blacks are equally well represented in this group as they are in the labor force as a whole. So big gap here that needs to be closed. Why is there a gap? Some of the traditional arguments that have been put forward are that there is a lack of human capital, a lack of social capital among black men in particular. What does this mean, human capital? It means the skills necessary to go to college, to succeed in college, and to then go to a professional school. So basically, lower SAT scores, having gotten lower GPA, and so forth. These things would count as low human capital. And social capital would be some of the wherewithal to know about how to negotiate the college application process, whether to think about and understand professional employment as an option. There's also an argument about an oppositional culture that exists within the black male population in particular. John Ogbu and his colleagues studied poor black high schools in Washington, D.C., and found that there was a huge resistance to doing what the teacher instructed, to participating in class, to reading the assigned readings. And why was there this resistance? Because it was thought of as acting white, right? There's a huge stigma to acting white and being like a nerd in class by doing the schoolwork. This has actually not been borne out in subsequent studies as something that is affecting the black population. Instead, if you look at poor high schools anywhere with any kind of racial composition, you're going to find elements of this oppositional culture. And if you look at, blacks who are in college, they're just as likely to have come from schools where there's an oppositional culture as are whites. So that's actually probably not a good explanation. Low quality schools is a really good explanation. So why are there lower SAT scores? Why are maybe some of the GPAs not as high once black men get into college? Well, part of it is that they tend to go to schools, and this is true for middle class, affluent black men as well as poor black men. They tend to go to schools that just don't have the kind of curricular opportunities that schools in majority white neighborhoods have. So they don't take AP Calculus, they don't take AP Physics. There isn't a good guidance counselor, maybe no guidance counselor at all to help with the college application process. And there's often just the infrastructure of the schools is quite poor, which makes it challenging to study day in and day out. And why are middle class and upper middle class blacks more likely to go to low quality schools than their white counterparts? Because due to racial residential segregation in America, middle class and upper middle class blacks are much more likely to live around poor people, mainly poor blacks, than are whites to live around poor people. Because there are much fewer whites relative to the size of the population that are poor. And finally, there is stereotype threat. So this is the golf study that looked at, if you prime someone with being this is about sports intelligence or this is about natural athletic ability, that's a test of stereotype threat. If a college student believes that blacks as a group are unintelligent, so this is if a black college student thinks that blacks as a group are unintelligent, they will do worse in college. They will have a lower GPA, they'll drop more classes, they're less likely to graduate. This is if they have internalized this stereotype of blacks as a group. And as a reminder, most blacks are aware that the stereotype exists. This is not the same thing as endorsing the stereotype. It's an awareness that whites hold the stereotype. There's a study by Camille Charles and her colleagues of blacks in selective colleges. So this is the Ivy League and a lot of fancy liberal arts colleges, and a few additional colleges, like Stanford. And Villanova wasn't included, but it could have been included in here. I mean, it was places where it's difficult to get in. It's competitive admissions, and reasonably high SAT scores. And this study found that stereotype threat is a strong predictor of poor performance freshman year, as is, of course, academic preparation. So having taken fewer of those AP classes means lower GPA. That's not terribly surprising. But the stereotype threat was a surprising finding, that it was such a strong predictor of poor performance. Another thing about blacks in selective colleges is that women outnumber men 2 to 1. Okay? This is a huge discrepancy and shows the special challenge that young black men face in just getting into college in the first place. 20% of blacks in selective colleges have a foreign-born parent, which is much, much higher than the rate for the black population as a whole. Black students are less prepared on average than our white or Asian students. They're only slightly less well prepared than Hispanic students, however. Nonetheless, and this is an important point to focus on, black students have higher levels of self-confidence and self-esteem than their white counterparts. This means that having higher self-esteem means that you will do better in school. You will have a higher GPA, better performance, and blacks have higher self-esteem. So this is a positive note to focus upon. And as I mentioned earlier, blacks are no more likely to have had an oppositional peer group in school than were white students. So what helps college performance? So this is, again, is part of our mobility route through the professional, through the professions. You have to do well in college to be admitted to law school, to be admitted to medical school. The first thing is getting help from your professors, but not too much help because we're really busy. So, no. Just kidding, okay. Those who went to visit their professors' office hours had significantly higher GPAs. And this is especially true for young black men who tend not to go to office hours. Those who go to office hours tend to get much higher GPAs. Involvement in community activities also increases GPAs, with the exception of Greek organizations for presumably obvious reasons. But community activities like organizations that are based on career interest, actually intramural sports. So this is not, D1 sports, but intramural sports. Those who play those sports tend to do better. Anything that involves building a community with other students tends to help college performance. Having high academic aspirations. So this sounds like an obvious one, right? What does it really mean? So people who start out college thinking, I'm going to get a PhD, I'm going to go to law school, do better in school. There's a very, very high, strong correlation between these factors. And of course, whites are more likely to have these high academic aspirations than are blacks. As I mentioned, high self-esteem, very strongly correlated with GPA. And this final point, little concern about being an affirmative action admit. There were a series of questions that were asked of black students in the study, these selective colleges. Do you think you're here because of affirmative action? And those who said yes did worse in school than those who said no. What about the student athlete and his performance? Nationwide, the black male graduation rate, this is a 6-year graduation rate from college, is an astonishing 38%. This increases to 48% for athletes. What explains the difference? Fewer financial concerns is the main explanation. Athletes tend to be on full rides and not have to worry about where they're going to pay for the next semester. And even though they do an enormous amount of work to get those scholarships, having to take a job off campus that's 40 plus hours a week is even more taxing than having the athletic career. However, in more selective schools, This one would include Villanova. Black non-athletes graduate at higher rates than black athletes. And this tends to be at more selective schools. There tends to be more financial support for undergraduates. And here we see this difference between the athlete and the non-athlete flip. You're better off being a non-athlete. So I've talked about how underrepresented blacks are in the professions. But I want to note that their numerical representation is actually quite high. So there is definitely grounds to have new stereotypes of who blacks are. That includes professors, of whom there's 70,000 black professors in America. Physicians and lawyers, there are 50,000 of each of those categories. And another 40 some odd thousand CEOs. There are only, this is again the athletes and coaches and umpires category, just under 30,000 in this category. So if you think about what really does represent black America in terms of these occupations, it's doctors and lawyers and professors, not athletes. So thinking strategically, if you were deciding upon a career as a lawyer or as a professional football player, what would be more lucrative? My knee-jerk response to this would be professional football player, of course. They're millionaires, right? And the answer to this is actually, no, you're better off being a lawyer. The average salary in the NFL is $770,000 a year. That's big money, right? We would love to have $770,000 a year. But the catch is the average career in the NFL is 3.3 years. It's even lower for running backs, wide receivers, and cornerbacks who tend to get tackled a lot, I guess. So this lifetime salary of the NFL player would be about $2.5 million. Sounds like big money. What about working a lifetime as a lawyer at $113,000 a year? This is the average that you make coming out of law school. If you go into a corporate firm right out of law school, and corporate firms are desperate to hire black men because they're wildly underrepresented, the average salary is much higher than the salary is much higher than $113,000. And you can expect this $113,000 salary to increase dramatically year after year, especially if you're working in a large firm. This results in lifetime earnings of double what you would earn if you were an NFL player. Now, to be fair, if I were comparing professional basketball players here, they would do better than lawyers over the lifetime. But an astonishing to me, 60%, I read the statistic, 60% of professional basketball players go bankrupt within 5 years of leaving the sport. This despite an average annual salary in the NBA of $5.5 million and a slightly longer career of about 5 years. But a lot of times people are taken advantage of by financial consultants and the like. And much less likely to happen if you're a lawyer. And physicians, it's an even right. Physicians, it's an even grosser difference. So I want to make sure we have plenty of time for discussion and close with a remark upon Martin Luther King's dream. The March on Washington was about education and it was about jobs. It wasn't about sports and the military. And it was about education and jobs because there was such a huge gap in the educational outcomes for blacks relative to whites. There's a huge differential in the employment rate and certainly the representation in the professions between blacks and whites. This was 50 years ago, okay? We still have these huge gaps in education. Now they're more gendered than they used to be. Black women have done relatively well. They still aren't at par with white women, but doing better in terms of educational attainment. Black men are not. And the same is true with representation in professional employment. What we as a society need to do is focus on providing opportunities for young black men to use and to profit from their intelligence, not their bodies. And I'll leave us with that. Thank you.
In a second, we'll get to the questions. I inadvertently forgot to present Monica with her honorarium for tonight, but I want to let you know that she has graciously offered to use part of this honorarium and give it back to the Center for Peace and Justice Education to reconstitute the St. Catherine of Siena Award, which we used to give yearly to the best student paper on an issue of social justice. So we're going to reconstitute that award either this year or next, thanks to Monica's generosity. Thank you. Now she can go.
I'm out of here.
Because she's so committed to undergraduate education, she wanted to leave a lot of time for questions and answers. Some of those of you who are in the ACS seminars may have received a group of readings, which Monica very graciously provided to me, which I then provided to the lords of ACS. Some of you who are in sociology classes may also have received some of these readings from a variety of sources. If you have questions about them and want to address them, or questions about the talk, or perhaps questions about what's going on right now here at Villanova, this is the time. We have microphones in each of the aisles, 1, 2, 3. We would ask that you come queue up politely, no fighting, unless you're a football player, want to knock people down, and ask your questions. And please don't be shy. We have all the time in the world until I have to leave. So please, young, medium, old, light, dark, male, female, other, whatever, please come ask your questions now, or I'm going to take the check back and cross out some of the zeros. All right? Come on, Nicole, let's go.
So you're saying that kind of what we need to do is kind of focus on how to encourage black men to use their intelligence. I guess what would be kind of the first steps to doing that, or I don't know if you know of any programs right now that are doing that. What are kind of the first steps to get there?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. And there are different routes, right? Because the problem with these stereotypes that go way back in history, they have their roots in the slave era and the notion of what black men were useful for. They were useful for their bodies, not for their minds. And that's where the stereotype originated. And it's the modern form, is that blacks tend not to be intelligent, blacks tend to be good athletes. Now, how do you combat something with roots that deep? Part of it is who we think of and give publicity to as sort of role models in the black community, right? Now, LeBron James has many merits, and he's often put forward as a role model, but he also is reinforcing some of these stereotypes. There are 70,000 black professors out there that can be put forward in the media and presented as people that are a part of this, that are a huge part of the black community, much greater part than the sports heroes and so forth. But more importantly than what the media can do, are institutional changes. And the most important institutional change would require a level of political and social will that we don't have in this country right now. And that would be a fundamental revision in how we fund public education in this country. It's funded with property taxes. So that means rich neighborhoods have good schools, and poor neighborhoods have crappy schools. And it's not just the type of education that people in the crappy schools are getting. It's also the kinds of messages that they absorb about, what they're capable of and who they are and where they're going in life. It's communicated at that level. And so, by the time you're looking at who's applying to law school and who's applying to medical school, so many of those smart young black men have been weeded out in the 9th grade. that's where we really need to change, and to have a much more egalitarian access to education. And it's partly institutional, it's partly the kinds of choices that many white people make all the time about where they buy a house. We bought a house here because of the schools. You hear that all the time from everybody. And that's part of the problem too. Now, in terms of programs that have been tried, the professional associations, the American Medical Association, American Bar Association, do have programs where they go into high schools and try to make high school students aware of these professions and the fact that they're, people like them can become doctors, can become lawyers. And, I don't know that there's been any thorough evaluation study of those kinds of programs yet, but it's a step in the right direction. But it's too small scale at this point to have any kind of meaningful impact. Yeah, thanks. Yeah.
Hi, my name is Evan. I'm actually a civil engineering major. I have two questions. The first one's kind of short. I was wondering if you had any insight on why this civil engineering statistics seem so low.
Mm-hmm.
And also, I've been involved at Villanova with a program where we bring students from local elementary schools in Philadelphia in. It's kind of like single conference of that
Mm-hmm.
trying to get kids interested in it.
Mm-hmm.
And what I gathered by the end of the day was that the most exciting part for the students was going to our athletic center, seeing one of the players walk by and giving them an autograph. And I'm pretty sure that's probably all they talked about when they got home. They were rocking everything. It was amazing. I was wondering if there was any positive impact at all about this. It's just a general first step in the direction of going to college.
So it's a really interesting example. And I wonder what the reaction was of the people who were leading the campus tours to the response to the athletes. One possible reaction could be, did you know that professors actually make, I don't know, just pull some huge figure out of the air, right? That's totally false. But, actually make, say, $100,000 a year, yeah. And, it's plenty of professors make more than that, plenty of us make less than that, but it's, it's this figure that sounds huge to somebody in elementary school, right? Oh, they do? Yeah, that guy that, we saw in that class, or that woman that we saw in that class, she's really rich because she's a professor, Yeah, work with me on this example. Okay, it'd be better if they were touring med schools, right? Say, that surgeon over there, he really is rich, yeah. The glorification of the athlete that's part of the problem, right? I don't want to take anything away from athletes again. I mean, it's extraordinarily. I mean, there's so much competition to be a D1 athlete that people who are, they're right to be in awe of people who are, playing basketball or football at Villanova. But it's this problem that's the key. That's the only way, and that's what has to be counterbalanced in that case. And in terms of the civil engineering figure, there's a huge problem with a huge gap in terms of math and science interest in the Black community as a whole. Again, the gap is a lot smaller with women than it is with blacks. And that's something that, again, has its roots in the quality of education from the beginning. I mean, that's a very rigorous curriculum that has to be studied to be able to come into college and start those engineering classes the first semester and to succeed in them. One has to be extraordinarily well prepared in high school. I mean, you can't not have taken calculus and expect to just bound into a civil engineering major. And so that's a huge part of the discrepancy, that the engineering is much more extreme than many of the other majors in terms of the black-white differential.
My name's Laura, I'm a sophomore. I was going to ask, even though like a lot of black males come to colleges for like scholarship, don't you think it's a good like still like bringing people to college that may not even have thought about college in the first place.
I think I'm totally with you, but and let me tell you why I'm with you. That you're absolutely right. That any time any scholarship is given to any black man to get to college, it's a good thing, right? It's helping to reduce this discrepancy. It's helping to provide opportunity. The problem, though, is that there are so many black men out there who should be getting academic scholarships, but who, for whatever reason, whether it's they don't know how to negotiate the process, or they don't know that studying for the SATs actually makes them go up higher, or any number of reasons in terms of poor quality of education and lack of social capital. And if we were to take some of those athletic scholarships, who are then, and let's say they're going to men who wouldn't otherwise think about college, and give them to another set of men who aren't going to college because the scholarships are being given to people who play sports, then we'd end up with more engineering majors. We'd end up with less of an association of black men with sports and with athletics, and more of an association of black men with good students who take tough classes. Good question.
Okay, my name is Megan. I'm from Baltimore, and I wanted to know what advice would you give to like higher education institutions like Villanova who contribute to the stereotype area, like glorifying
Mhm.
and like providing them with the they have everything set. What advice would you give to institutions like Villanova?
Well, let me throw it back. What do you think would be a good counterbalance to that? I have an idea, but I just want to. What do you think? What would you do if you were in charge?
Well, honestly, I think that like all of that, the whole basketball that it should be like I would like to consider the multicultural during school with the white program and have like a certain program for like the non-black male athletes, but
Mm-hmm.
I feel like that's a step, but it's still like people come to the level for the basketball games. Like last year when we had like students come from high school and they were like, "Where's Scotty Reynolds?" And I'm
Mhm.
like, "What? Are you the professor? Why are you looking at Scotty Reynolds?"
See, you got the problem solved right there. But okay, so I think that, I mean, you're right, the glorification of athletes is a huge part of the problem. And what if we, every time athletes are glorified, counter that with the glorification of brilliant black men on campus? What would that do to the sense that the Villanova community has about A, who the black male students on campus are, and B, the sense that, wow, black men are really smart, right? And I think that would be one possible route. Another possible route would, of course, would just be to tone it down a little bit on the glorification of the athletes. But I think that's probably an impossibility at this institution at this point in time. But I don't know. Yeah. Yeah. Thank you.
Hi, my name is Ron. I'm a junior here. I have a question. Considering the condition of inner city school systems and somehow the lack of resources that are for students to advance in a collegiate sense, how do you convince those students who are in those situations that an athletic scholarship is not the only way to continue education?
Yeah, that's great. So I think one thing that I found in talking with low-income students of any race and gender is that they're completely naive about how likely it is for them to go to college without paying any money out of pocket, right? That especially the selective schools. The Ivy Leagues and Stanford and some places like that, that you don't even have to take out any loans, right? If your parents make less than $60,000 a year, right? The median family income in America is about $42,000. So it's $60,000 or less. You go to school for free, right? You can apply for free, and if you get in, You come, you do the work, you get a BA from a selective university. And, leaving aside the Scott-free, the $60,000 limit, many selective schools that tend to have, relatively deep pockets have a lot of money available for financial aid for students. And there's just an incredible degree of ignorance about this possibility. And that's true for the inner city, it's true for, rural America, whites living in rural America. Many people are unaware of how possible college is for them financially. People see dollar signs, they see look at the tuition, they say, forget it, it's not going to happen. And so communicating the fact that you could go to school for free if you work really hard. If you try to get to school by playing football or basketball or whatever, your chances are of getting that D1 scholarship are 1 in 40. If you're a varsity starter on the team, and if there's this show of numbers, I think, then that can be part of it. That's not going to compensate for the fact that there are disaffected teachers and buildings that are falling apart and a lack of courses that are, that are needed, that are being offered. That's a bigger structural problem, but there can be a different story communicated. Thank you.
Lindsay Michael, I'm a junior. I was wondering what you felt about situations that happen at a lot of these selective colleges where I feel like, at least with Villanova, we do a great job of having these good community service organizations, but a lot of the times what happens is either we bring these kids from Philadelphia who are usually all black to campus, or we go out to their schools, and usually what they're seeing is all white faces. So I was wondering how, I feel like it's a two-sided coin, but I'm not sure, like how positive or negative. It's definitely positive, but I just was wondering what your take on that kind of situation is.
No, I think that's actually a huge issue. And it's the quote I showed you from the study about the black male athletes experience on the Northeastern College campus. That was so because it was majority white college campus. On college campuses that have a larger black population, the experience tends to not be so negative. So it's a real problem. How do you attract more students of color to a school that is going to, looks very alienating in terms of its racial composition? And the only thing, there is no easy answer, easy response to that. To the degree that the black community, however small it is at Villanova, can come together to say, listen, here are the positives, here are the negatives. This is what our experience is like. This is what the school's like here. That's all you can do. Thank you.
I'm Tom, I'm a junior. I was in a program in high school, it's called the Aspirations.
Oh yeah, that's a terrific program. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Takes care of student kids and brings them to better boarding schools.
Mm-hmm.
I noticed that some of those things you were talking about with kids being as if they're not as smart as a white population, where most of these students, these specialists are white.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's good. It was a good transition for those kids. But what I noticed was they had a tough transition through those 4 years. So coming to Villanova, for the kids or athletes who didn't do that program, it's interesting to see the cultural barriers they have. So as a university, Villanova, when they recruit these kids, I think the high numbers kind of attribute to the fact that maybe these kids, that they're protecting these kids as a group because they know there's a lot of barriers and cultural difficulties when it comes to
Yeah, the program that you mentioned, A Better Chance, is one that we do have clear evaluation studies of, and it's just a rousing success. Aside from the psychological costs of making the transition to this, very elite. It's not just a majority white community, but it's a very elite, very upper class white community as well. Part of the reason that it worked, I can do this because I've been tapped on the head as being one of the smart ones.
Would you address the situations where Villanova recruits, mostly inner city kids who may not have done good enough credit if they're
A reason behind why they recruit there?
mostly black athletes that haven't had these opportunities. Do you think they're trying to protect these students because they haven't had the chance to, adapt to situations like this?
Yeah, I'm not sure protect in what way, but
Just the adapt to the school atmosphere.
it could be. I mean, I don't really know enough about the particular ways in which athletes are or are not integrated at Villanova, but could very well be, yeah.
Hello, my name is Ruben Mays. I'm a sophomore here in business school. Yeah, my name is Ruben Mays. I'm a sophomore here in business school, and I just wanted to. I know most of your research seems to be directed with the African American community. I can help but notice there was some stats up there with the Hispanic and Latino community. And I was just wondering if you could get some insight on the same factors that you just showed in your presentation also affect that community in the same way, and maybe give a little insight on that.
Yeah, no, that's an excellent point, excellent question. I didn't talk about the Asian community either, which actually outpaces the white community by a long shot on all of the measures of educational attainment, representation in professional occupations, and the like. The Hispanic population is an interesting case because it's so incredibly heterogeneous, much more heterogeneous even than the black population, which is itself heterogeneous. And it's heterogeneous in two ways. One is in terms of immigrant generation, so whether the people who are being counted are themselves immigrants or whether they've been in the country for several generations. The more generations you are in the country on average, the higher the degree of educational attainment, and the more likely one is to be in a professional occupation. It's also complicated by nation of origin. So immigrants from, or Hispanics who have heritage in Central America or Mexico tend to do less well in the educational system and in terms of professional attainment than do those who have their origins in Cuba or South America. So it's a complicated story, but there is a subset of the Hispanic population that looks a lot like the young black male population I've been talking about, where you see the gender gap, and you see also this sense that college is an impossibility, even though they may have, absolutely the backgrounds to get into college. And this is Hispanic men who live in inner cities in the West and the Southwest, and go to the same kinds of schools that poor black male population is attending. And then, surprise, surprise, the profile looks a lot like the poor black male profile. Thanks. Good question.
Hi, my name is Mike, and I just had a question. A lot of the information you provided dealt with specific statistics as to specific stereotypes. In your opinion, does any of this information show one stereotype or a group of stereotypes as being particularly damaging? And if so, do you think this has anything to do with how you can go about solving these problems?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, I think probably the most damaging stereotype in the research on stereotype threat has been shown to be the one about intelligence. Now, there are situations in which the stereotype about tendency to behave in criminal behavior is problematic, especially if you're a law enforcement officer and you have this stereotype, it can lead to negative outcomes. But broadly speaking, in terms of educational and occupational attainment, it's the stereotype about intelligence. Claude Steele did an experiment where he showed that merely having a student write what their race was on the cover sheet before handing in a test led to lower scores than a comparison group of students where they didn't write what their race was on the test. And the argument about that is that this stereotype about blacks and intelligence is so widely known that it's actually been internalized to a lesser degree. And I think that's extraordinarily damaging and where we should be focusing our energies. Yeah, thanks. Mhm.
from utilizing these students as a money-making
Yep.
scheme almost. And whose responsibility is it to step up and change the system? Is it the NCAA who's making profit, the universities who are also making profit, at the same time the parents who just see this as an opportunity to get their child to get a college education that they may otherwise not got? Whose responsibility is it to put this in
Right.
situation?
That's an excellent question. And I would argue that each university needs to figure out what its mission is. And it needs to figure out where its profits are coming from, or whether it's a nonprofit institution whose interests are in serving the educational needs of the students that are enrolled at the university. There are many, many universities that have extremely high application rates, extremely high rates of alumni donations, and they don't have a Division I sports team, period. Right? The entire Ivy League, right? Many, NYU, University of Chicago. These are, top academic institutions that are enormously profitable, have very deep pockets, huge endowments, and no sports to speak of. So that's a route that those universities have taken. Now, it's not a route that's open to everyone, every university. I think big state universities would have a hard time just doing away with D1 athletics. But I think places like Villanova, that are selective private institutions, have choices to make about where athletics fit in their mission, and whether it's something that generates profit and perhaps increased alumni donations, whatever the case may be, or whether it's something that is something that can bring about community amongst the student body and the alumni, but isn't seen as a way of exploiting labor for profit. The NCAA, on the other hand, it exists to maintain the profitable, sports life of its member institutions. So I don't think that's the place to look for it to start.
I just feel like it's a shame that these students who aren't getting as full of quality education as they could if they weren't driven by their
Yep.
athletics, I feel that they're the victims of the scheme.
There are two different ways of thinking about it, right? Are they the victim relative to non-athletes on campus who aren't being, let's say, used in the same way? Yes. Are they a victim relative to their counterparts that didn't get the opportunity to go to college and they only went? Then no, So it cuts both ways. Thank you.
Okay.
Go ahead.
I'm Kiara, and I am a sophomore and an research major at Georgetown College in Baltimore. You briefly mentioned that, the stigma in African American students in schools, they don't perform well because, they don't want to be white.
Mm-hmm.
And I just wanted to know, what the actual individual in that classroom, or what the teacher or student teacher or professor can do to, treat that stereotype or treat that, I just wanted to
Yeah.
know.
Well, fortunately, it turns out to be a lot less common than was originally thought. So it's in many classrooms not the case that students worry about acting white. In those cases where it is, I think there are a whole host of images of successful black men and women to point to say, how do you think this lawyer that is, in the picture I showed, it was the three top lawyers in Dallas, three top black lawyers in Dallas-Fort Worth metropolitan area. And one of them is a general counsel for 7-Eleven, the other one for the parent airlines, a parent company of American Airlines. These men are making millions of dollars a year. Holding up a picture and saying, look, these guys are making millions of dollars a year because they did their homework. That may have some kind of impact. It may not, right? There's this fundamental alienation in the poorest schools in a city like Washington, D.C., where the opportunities in these schools are so few that, frankly, I would adopt an oppositional culture myself. And so trying to counter that is extremely difficult, and really structural transformation needs to happen.
Thank
Okay,
you.
thank you.
Thank you very much for informative, substantive remarks. My name is Edwin Cobb, and I'm a senior as certified by Medicare. When I graduate from Villanova, I plan to go into law. And I have the following question. Would you be able to give us a brief narrative of your movement as a young person from Greenville, South Carolina, up north to Villanova University in 1989, and the movement for your 4 years, Dr. Eckstein and contrary notwithstanding, you probably had a pretty normal and exciting set of intellectual challenges. But could you give us a brief narrative of perceptions, your experiential reflections upon your alma mater in the year 2011 in comparison with where you were in 1989 through 1993 while you were on the other side? That's part one.
Yeah, that was a multi-part part one. Okay.
In that question of what do you have to say to those among us who are in higher education as lifers, who understand that, oh God, the times they are changing, to be able to change with the times so as to both gain access to and to implement the scientific findings that you have presented among the wealth of data analyses and conclusions that we have to deal
Okay.
with today.
Thank you, Dr. Goff. Yeah, okay. Well, so the first part, I think if I remember correctly, those many minutes ago, was something about my experience at Villanova and thinking about it and how it relates to looking at it now, right? Okay. So I will, so I actually, when I applied to Villanova, was actually coming from a family that was below the poverty line, and I myself thought there was no way of affording college. And then I saw and I got some material from Villanova in the mail about this presidential scholarship program they had, and I thought maybe that's a way I can go to college. And I applied and it worked out, and I came here and I was incredibly grateful to be here. And I thought, never occurred to me to have any kind of postgraduate plans. I was just glad to be in college and enjoyed my classes, especially interdis, which started out with was a fantastic experience. Interdis, yeah. And it was in actually, having close contact with my professors and visiting them during office hours and getting to know them better, that the thought that this could actually be a career that would be enjoyable and pleasant to me arose. And that was what I decided to do with much support from professors in various departments, not just in sociology department. And so I had a wonderful experience as an undergraduate here, and it was a totally transformative experience in many, many ways. Looking back at it, looking at Villanova now, I think it's hard for me to say. I still have this sense of gratitude that I had as an undergraduate that is kind of hard to shake, even though there may be decisions that the institution makes or is about to make that I may not agree with, but that's okay. I mean, that's part of what happens. I don't agree with any institution's decisions entirely. I'd be a total tool if I did. I think it's the institution's diversity is actually greater than it was when I was here in 1989, believe it or not, but it's true. And I think that's a very, very good thing. And I think to the extent that there is Maybe there's some problems about, I think the figure about 37% of black male undergraduates being here on a sports scholarship is a problem. So there are problems like that aren't easy to fix, but that I think the institution should be trying to fix. That's kind of where I am looking at it now from what I know, but it's a very different perspective. And then part two was, I guess, essentially how to get the word out, so that people in... Yeah, I mean, I think that these studies on, two sets of studies that are really important. One are the concrete studies of actual college performance among large representative samples of college students about what helps and what doesn't help. Like tutoring programs at the college level don't help, even though these community involvement activities do help. That kind of information is great. It provides like concrete points of action for us in higher education. The other set of studies I think that's very important are the Stereotype Threat studies, because this is the kind of thing that we're all players in without realizing it, I think. And understanding the kind of impact that something as simple as saying this is a test of intelligence, this is a test of athletic ability, the impact that those kinds of short statements can have on student performance, whether it be an athletic test or an academic test. It shows we need to be really careful about how we talk in the classroom as well as our own internal expectations that we have.
I just had another question. Last year I was involved in the same type of program that brought students to the school. And I was helping teach discrimination to linguistics and majors. And I guess for our benefit as the tutors, the teachers that run the students to name all different states. And after starting with Mexico and Canada, the student went on to remember any state based on his sports team. And so got to about 40 from there and to
Oh, that's impressive.
more careers.
Yeah.
I recognize that despite the working of the teacher of the school, of all the programs there, that this force of romanticizing sports is much greater than anything else that the student experienced. I was wondering if you had any kind of opinion or insight on the other side, not only bringing in programs to help students and these type of things, but also de-romanticizing sport itself. I know it's not an easy thing to say to just fix, but I was wondering if you had any
Yeah.
kind of opinion on that.
It's tough. I mean, it's a so deeply embedded part of American culture. It transcends race even. I mean, you think about the small town high school football team, right, in places like Texas. It's huge. It's what the community comes around, is this team. And of course they're glorified, the athletes who are involved. And I don't think that there is any way to institute any kind of single program that's going to change this deeply embedded aspect of our culture. I think rather than focusing on de-romanticizing athletes, I think it's probably easier to romanticize the intellectual life, especially at earlier ages. Maybe it's not that easy, but possible. Yeah.
Hi, my name is Lacey. I'm a senior. First, I just want to say thank you for coming and speaking to us today. I think I'm especially grateful that you put your speech, you made it so relevant to us here at Villanova. So thank you for that. My question is this. I noticed that your graph on stereotypes was based in 1993. And I was wondering if there was any new findings, especially with the advent of like social media. I thought that maybe opening up the airways of communication might have changed those stereotypes.
Yeah, excellent question. The study of meta-stereotypes that I showed, there hasn't been a new study of that. So what do blacks believe that whites think about them? That piece of it that hasn't been updated. However, there have been many more recent studies that ask whites questions like, it'll be a 10-point scale, and it'll say, do you think that blacks tend to be intelligent or that they tend to be unintelligent? And then you can position, their score. They'll be, 1 for intelligent, 10 for unintelligent. And so those kinds of questions have been asked much more recently. And there actually isn't a lot of movement on the stereotype questions. There's movement on some of the questions about how integrated a neighborhood people want to live in. So whites are now saying that they want to live in more integrated neighborhoods than they used to say that they wanted to live in. Would you mind if your son or daughter married a black person? Many fewer whites mind than they used to. But with the stereotypes, there isn't much movement. The exception being whites have become progressively more likely to say that blacks tend to commit crimes. So that one is becoming more problematic than it used to be. But the intelligence one has been very stable over time.
Isn't that kind of in line with how many blacks are attaining prison recently?
Absolutely. As the huge upswing in the incarceration of black men it occurred with the advent of the war on drugs. And the vast majority of the offenses that black men are in prison for are drug offenses. And not violent crimes, actually, but drug offenses. And of course, there's going to be hopefully, in fact, some correlation between reality and beliefs. It's a misplaced correlation, but it is very much related to the increase in incarceration rates. Yeah.
Hi, my name is Amanda, and I'm a sophomore. I was wondering if you could elaborate on some of the differences in the statistics between black men and black women. Black men are coming under this pressure of getting involved in sports or military, so I was wondering what sort of expectations or self-expectations do black women have?
So the big divider there, black women are much more likely to go to college, period, and much more, even greater difference when you look at selective colleges. So, and they're doing better socioeconomically. So in general, black women have better outcomes than black men. But that said, among black women, the big choice point seems to be between choosing to have a family very early in life or choosing to pursue education. And that's the big push and pull that black women are experiencing. There's a big class difference, though. The pull to experience a family formation early in life is much more common among lower SES black women. Middle and upper middle class black women are going to college at very high rates. Thank you.
My name is Alexandra. I'm in one of the UCS classes, and so my question is one of the articles that was sent. The question I have, it ties in with this article and the issue of responsibility and value, is do you believe that the black church is as relevant today as it was for Martin Luther King Jr. in his day? I know that our president and his family was having a celebration of Martin Luther King Jr. Day by attending church services at one of the historic black churches in Washington, D.C. And I know that a black church represents a Baptist with a significant influence on Martin Luther King Jr.'s life. We understand, in his own father, the war that made it a central part of their lives. Much of the sense of community, social, and moral values, support, and encouragement came from being a participant in the black church. Do you think that still exists today?
Yeah, that's a good question. The black church is still very much a strong and powerful institution. And in terms of religiosity, so rates of church attendance and rates of belonging to a congregation, blacks are much higher than any other racial group. So the presence of the church in black America is still very, very strong. Now, it's unclear that the black church has the kind of socio-political power that it had in Martin Luther King's day, where there was a very strong and powerful network of elite black churches throughout America that could very quickly organize to have marches, protests, boycotts, etc. I don't think that that exists to the same extent today. It's a much more diffuse set of institutions and much less sociopolitically involved. Thank you.
Well, I don't really have a question. I just want to say that we're done, and I want to thank everyone. Well, those of you who stayed till